It's funny, I was teasing with Linda before we started about creating some kind of outrageous, raging argument about what is real and what isn't. And but it was funny, and we had not discussed at all what we were going to do. I mean, I did not know that we were going to be paired, and I certainly wasn't familiar with the subject matter really till I got here. But I think there's so many things that I want to say that will easily dovetail with what she was talking about. One thing is the references to magic. To me, in poetry, magic is really mostly manifest in metaphor. When it obliges you to see what you couldn't have seen, you know, or to see what isn't real, capital R, but we recognize the truth of it anyway. I'll talk more about it and hopefully it'll make more sense. I was gonna start just by trying to recite a poem by Theodore Roethke, who you also mentioned, which is so interesting. I know we probably have nothing but love by the end of this. But I was gonna recite this poem and because it's a poem to me that contains some of the things I love about metaphor, and also, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's really, to me, real proof of the magic in metaphor. It's called In a Dark Time. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood. A lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have, a steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day, the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is, death of the self in a long, tearless night, all natural shapes blazing, unnatural light, dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which I is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. I mean, there's so many things going on in that poem, and I won't talk about it because I didn't give copies of that out. But one of the things that sometimes I think we forget about poetry is certainly we try as best we can as readers to tune into the actual things that the language says. We do. But you were talking about silence, and of course, that's part of, that's what line breaks and stanza breaks are, right? They're hints at the silence on either end of the line, right? And hints of the silence out of which everything comes, right? We don't think of it very much because we're so busy trying to master the craft of what the words do, right? But it's easy to forget that. The other thing that I think about when I think about metaphor is the way a poem sounds, and I'm not going to talk much about that, but certainly the sounds of a poem are some kind of approximation also of what is felt, right? Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire, right? Those D's. No one will ever convince me that Roethke didn't realize he was adding those D's up that way. Of course he did. He knew something was going on with that, those D's that were hitting kind of like a hammer, right? You know. And then of course, my soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Now, on the one hand, all of us have seen flies do that, kind of basically kill themselves trying to get out of the window. But when you pair that with the concept of the soul, it's like your head almost blows off. You know what I mean? That's what I mean. That's in part what I'm talking about when I talk about metaphor, and really metaphor being, in so many respects, the centerpiece of poetry and the main come hither aspect of it, right? I wrote down here, metaphor as an umbrella for all the language we employ to intensify the emotive and intellectual crucible of the poem. And Tom Lux yesterday talked about metaphor as speaking of one thing in terms of another. And it's funny, when you step back, of course, language itself is an approximation of all we experience, right? I mean, all this that I'm doing now is an invention in search of a way of addressing ourselves to experience, right? And so when we think about the poem, what we're doing is turning up the volume on language. That's, to me, part of what poetry does. It's the force, metaphor is the force by which we make language do more or be louder. I mean, we spend our days to varying degrees talking about, small things, crap, as you referred to yesterday, Tom. There's a bunch of nonsense that we read and say, and we're just getting through the day trying to be as practical and sane as possible. But the poem says, no, words are remarkable. Poems want us to listen differently, right? To change the level of our attentiveness, to ratchet up the ways in which we're listening. We go through the days, we do our best, but mostly half listening to what's going on around us. Even people we like in conversation, we're often allow our minds to wander when we're in the midst of conversation. But in the poem, in the best moment of the poem, we don't do that. The poem we give our whole mind and heart to, right? And that's what the poem wants. And I think also as poets, as writers, we want our audience to feel compelled to attend to our poems. I always tell my students, nobody writes poetry so that nobody will notice. No one does that, right? We want that. We want people to say, wow, I remember that poem, or I'd like to hear that poem, or where can I get that poem, or I've been thinking about what you wrote, or whatever, And so if you think about it, given the kind of busyness of our daily lives and how much it remains largely in shadow because we're distracted. We're just distracted. There's all kinds of crap going on all the time, and your brain is here and there at the same time. And so in that respect, we do kind of, even though literally it's not the case, we do kind of find ourselves living in shadow, almost always, in the sense that we do not see clearly or distinctly most of the time. Our attention is too divided, and we're doing too many things to actually notice that we're even where we are, right? And so in that respect, we think of poetry in particular, and all art, truthfully, but poetry for our purposes here, and its use of metaphor is kind of a way to create a kind of light that for a second pushes back the shadows. For a second we say, oh, that, like that thing, we see it clearly in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise. You can think about it any way you want, but if you read any of the poems you love best, you'll find that moment in them where you say, that thing is what I feel. As opposed to, I kind of feel this and I kind of feel that. And, yeah, it's okay, I'm all right. Are you okay? I'm all right. You're okay? Which is how we get through the day. But in the moment, in the deeper reaches of our own souls, there's parts of us that are desperate. I think Stephen Dunn talked about it as crucial speech. I think in that book, Walking Light, he mentioned something about crucial speech. And I think that poetry is that, but metaphor is that squared, All right. I also wanted to say that even though I'm thinking about, I'm talking about a metaphor here to writers and what we might, in with regard to what we might do with metaphor, but it's also something that I think we kind of take for granted, in the sense that I really like just discovering things through metaphor, through various figures of speech, right? You just, like, even if no one ever saw something, sometimes you'll stumble into something in a poem or writing a draft and think, that is really crazy. And I think about it. Poetry, writing of any kind, and most of the arts, is a relatively lonely thing. It's just, you can't really do it in groups, not really. And so it's often very solitary. And so there's a sense that one can be weighed down by the pursuit of the right word or the right speech. But occasionally we get a little gift, and I think many times that gift is in the connection we make in metaphor, like seeing something that we didn't see before, or even stumbling into something that may not be quite accurate, but we saw. But even in the slight misfiring, we saw a spark that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, which might lead us to something that we see that reveals something that we need. I like to think of that, even though it's often a pain in the ass because we often don't get the right thing very easily, but that pressing on words that we do, when we kind of push words, or we try to push words to the brink of what they might mean in various combinations, that thing is also exciting in a way. It's like, this is probably not a good enough metaphor. It's probably not good enough, but the idea of if you've been an athlete, or if you've done anything that requires a certain kind of strength or speed, feeling yourself at the absolute edge of what you're capable of, it's very exhausting, of course, if you've ever run really far or played way too much basketball. But there's a point at which you feel somehow deeply enmeshed in your own bones because of it. Like, you know your body in a way that you couldn't have known it without pushing it to the brink of its basically collapse. And I think often that's what we're doing with language when we're searching for the right metaphor. We're trying to push it to this edge where if you go much further, it will just snap and make no sense at all. And we've all seen poems, surrealist and otherwise, that we just don't know what the hell they're talking about. But that's one of the risks you have to take, I think, when you're chasing down certain things. All right. Okay, I wrote this at the last part of my notes. I said, if poetry is a fire in the mind, then metaphor is an accelerant, and poets are arsonists. All right, anyway. Let me read this, let me talk. I'll read these poems and I'll just make brief comments and then I'll be done. I'm not gonna be here too long. I wanted to start with that poem by Patrick Rosal, Kundiman on a Dance Floor Called Guernica. I just wanted to read it aloud to you and maybe highlight a couple of the moments that I think are those accelerated moments, those moments when, we're moving along and then we feel our brains or our hearts or some combination thereof kind of move into warp drive just for a second to make a connection that we didn't know was there. Like that moment, And what I love too about, even though being human is difficult, it is indeed. But one of the cool things about having this big ass brain that we have is that it can do things at speeds that are just unheard of. In fact, so fast, we aren't even aware of them unless someone says, but look what you had to do to make that make sense, Anyway, all right. Kundiman on a Dance Floor Called Guernica, and this is the epigraph. And some of you know this. This is an old rap song. Don't push me, 'cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. All right. This woman and I are watching the B-boys contort cocksure swagger into dance down to the very ligament. Their bodies are wattage, their names writ in whiskey and smoke, their legs scribbling into the room's boned twilight, a gospel according to Duke. These dancers are thunder's bastards, and at the borders of their human maelstrom, a woman's hips are winding their own slow vortex between my hands. We time with our waists, Each sweat-slick bass note hangs in the room like a heavy bruise, healing its way to another storm. I am losing my hands to her. I am learning to drown above water. But make no mistake, we think we are not in love and no one can hear us. We are moaning for each other's air. Now, because we're adult readers and we've been doing words for a long time, there's all kinds of things we got. But imagine trying to explain this to like a 7-year-old. You know what I mean? And I'm not talking about the subject matter per se in terms of its eroticism and all that. I mean just the language, the idea of drowning above water. Most of us at this age, we're like, of course. I mean, because we've been in the dilemma of being alive long enough that we're like, yeah, I'm drowning all the damn time above water, right? But to a child, they would just say, that does not make sense. One does not drown out of water, period, right? But bit by bit, your mind is able to make these lightning fast connections. I doubt anybody in here sat and stared at those lines a long time trying to figure out what was intended. But it's certainly not logical. It isn't. And then, of course, there are the other things. I love, for example, thunder's bastards, right? What does that mean, right? Is that an insult? You know what I mean? If you were to try to read these things literally, you would be lost, right? But because we naturally, I mean, you guys are writers and lovers of poetry, so you do this probably better than many people. But I would say most adults who give a damn or actually attending the language would get it pretty quickly. This is this loud-ass music. They're dancing and the bass is rumbling. Thunder's back. It just makes sense, right? It just connects, you know, things like that. And we know that a bass note doesn't really have sweat on it. You can't really put sweat on a bass note. But we know when he says each sweat-slick bass note hangs in the room like a heavy bruise, healing its way to another storm, we're like, of course, of course, of course, of course, right? You know what I mean? This is what I mean. But if you try to subtract these things out of the poem, I think the poem, I think you were saying this also, Linda. I mean, I think the poem just, it's not a poem anymore. I mean, you could say, come to men on a dance floor called Guernica. I really, really, really liked dancing with this woman a lot. The end. You could do it. You could, right? You could do it. But it's not poetry anymore. You know what I mean? I mean, when you think about it, in part, and it's funny because after a lot of years, you start to think you have some real wisdom about things. But honest to God, I'm not sure how to explain certain things, but there is a sense that, at least for me, and I'll get as close as I can to it, that when something is right, like the example of the bass note, the sweat-slick bass note, et cetera, it's as though we are pulled really close. It's like we get suddenly we're given a close-up on life or something like that. I don't know what it is. I think about, like in a movie, you know, the far shot. Nick, what's it called when the wide shot, the far shot or whatever, the panoramic view where you're way back, and then all of a sudden you zoom in and you see this thing, and it becomes more real than real. You know what I mean? And I think that's in part what metaphor wants to do. It reminds us that even though, for the most part, we kind of wander in a kind of haze of busyness, that there are things that can be known, and there are ways in which our lives do make particular kinds of sense. And if we subtracted poetry from the world, art in general certainly, but poetry in particular, I do think the world becomes a much more impossible place. I mean, it's damn difficult as it is, but I mean, I think it becomes much more difficult to manage. I think I'm in a haze 2/3 of my time above when I'm awake, right? But during reading poems and writing poems, there are moments when I think I really, for a moment, get it. I get part of what it means to be a person and why it's difficult, and also why, you know, it can be lovely, you know, and that poetry helps me, I think. This is the next poem by Sexton, an old poem by Sexton. It's again and again and again. And it's in a very different mood. But again, I picked this poem because there are things going on in here that are just, man, they almost swallow my face. There's the intensity of the metaphor. The epigraph is, you said the anger would come back just as the love did. I have a black look I do not like. It is a mask I try on. I migrate toward it, and its frog sits on my lips and defecates. It is old. It is also a pauper. I have tried to keep it on a diet. I give it no unction. There is a good look that I wear, like a blood clot. I have sewn it over my left breast. I have made a vocation of it. Lust has taken plant in it, and I have placed you and your child at its milk tip. Oh, the blackness is murderous, and the milk tip is brimming, and each machine is working, and I will kiss you when I cut up 12 new men, and you will die somewhat, again and again. You talk about really a very dark place in the heart, right? But if you tried to read this poem literally, you wouldn't know what to do, right? But you don't. You quite naturally realize what she's doing is trying to talk of something in terms of something else. There is no frog that sits on anybody's lip and defecates, at least that I know of. But we certainly understand what she means. It is not a good thing. Whatever it is not a good thing, right? Right? Yeah. I think about it this way also in terms of the idea of metaphor being an amplifier of a sort. I think about guitar, for example, before amplification. 6 strings, E, A, D, G, B, E, right? And then along comes the amplifier, same instrument, right? But something completely else becomes possible, right? And I think of that too. I mean, these are words like any words, but in certain combinations, they become much louder and they hit us much harder. You know what I mean? When I was in graduate school, I remember I said to a friend of mine, wouldn't it be just kind of amazing if all we did was speak to each other like poetry? And at the time I was thinking that would be just really like cool. And now I think your head would explode. You couldn't take it all the time. You know what I mean? If people were always like on that edge, right, of letting you know the sharpest point in their soul, you'd be like, no, please, no more. I can't take it, So on the one hand, you think, yeah, I think the amplification is needed and necessary in a cool part of language and poetry, but God knows if we did it all the time, I'm not sure you could ever get used to it exactly, but also I don't think you could take it, truthfully, any more than you could take being in a room with really, really loud music all the time. It'd be hard. Let me see, where is it? Oh, the whole idea of cutting up 12 new men, and you will die somewhat, again and again. Oh, mercy me. All right. Okay, I'll just do one of the Lucille Clifton poems. I'll do Hag Riding, just to take us out of that really black-hearted place that Sexton was in. But please do check out Atlas. It's a small persona poem in Atlas's voice, but it's doing a lot more work than what we would imagine the story of Atlas to do. But Hag Riding, I just so love it. Hag Riding. Why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the African in me, still trying to get home after all these years. But when I wake to the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, something hopeful rises in me, rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high over the rump of the day, and honey, I ride. Right? It's just too much, man. Every time I read that, I get this electric charge, and you're like, yeah, I'm ready for the day. Oh, man. But yeah, the whole idea again, and it starts again with relatively plain speech, right? I mean, why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the African in me still trying to get home after all these years. It's just straight talk. It's just straight talk. We're like, yeah, okay. You could ask that question of yourself, anybody. Why? I say, maybe it is the European in me. Maybe it is the, Aborigine in me. Anyone could ask that question, right? It could just be a simple question. But when I wake to the heat of the morning, still relatively normal language, galloping down the highway of my life, you can feel the volume going up, right? Something hopeful rises in me, and we're like, really? What might that be? Rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high. All right, already we got the thigh being lobbed. We're like, right? You feel it rising over the rump of the day, and then we're gone. Like, then we can feel it. The volume's on 10 now, right? And honey, I ride, right? So suddenly the day becomes a horse that you can ride. Bam, right? And of course a day is that kind of thing. Of course it is, right? That's how we get through the damn day, right? We ride through it. Even though, and probably everything we do is a metaphor. We just don't know. All right. And I'll go close to with Jim Zimmerman's piece. Sweet Jim. And again, speaking of one thing in terms of another, right? I mean, what can we do? Any of these poems, if you dig them or by all means, look up the poets and their work, of course. The gulls. For the sound of them, you'd think the gulls know something about sadness. All they do is cry. All they do is rock between their spindly legs and blink, as though befuddled by their own racket. You'd think they'd know to just shut up and fly. Their bones are white balsa where you find them on the beaches. Their tracks litter the sand. They perch on rocks like cold, bedraggled angels. You'd think they'd know the world's no place to land. I've stood once or twice like a gull with my feet in the water and my face in the wind. The salt air stung my eyes. I've straddled the tide and ridden it as far as it would take me. I've cried to hear myself cry. What the gulls lack is imagination. Each evening when the sun goes down, they think it's for the last time. They are unappeased by stars toward which their wings could lift them. They're unappeased by moonlight in which their feathers almost shine. Yeah, lovely. Anyway, I mean, I probably don't need to go over everything, but of course the idea of gulls as cold, bedraggled angels, right? Love that. And the thing is, what's funny, I think also, and most of you I know probably heard this in one form or another, is that even when the connections that are made are really, really odd. I mean, I generally speaking, before I read that poem, I never said to myself, that gull looks like a cold, bedraggled angel. I never ever did that, But what I love about metaphor in its best moment is that when you hear it, it feels like, well, of course. Like, yeah, of course. Like, I see that, Maybe you guys are saying, we still don't see it, But you know what I mean? There's a sense that there's this sudden sense of recognition of the precision of something. And that we live in a world that, at least on the surface of things, is pretty messed up, and there's a lot of ugliness that we wrestle with on lots and lots of levels. But I do think, in part, one of the values of art in general, but poetry in particular, is the opportunities it gives us to see in some relatively concrete form, magic in action. And for the most part, our daily lives, our workaday lives, oblige us to really kind of go into a kind of stupor, a kind of zombified stupor. And poetry essentially says no to that. And in that way, I think poetry is always like this kind of wild horse in the culture. It's always saying, but no, there's more, and you should see it. No, there's more, and you should feel it, right? It's always doing that. And to the extent that I think most of us are dissatisfied with the idea of being a zombie, we owe a lot, to such things, as metaphor and poetry and art, the larger world of art. And that's really all I wanted to say to you as writers. It's like, man, don't sell it short. There's so much magic right at our hands, or right in the center of our brains, or something, right, that we can play with. But thank you. Thanks, thank you.